June 28, 1709. A field near Poltava. The very air is a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of Ukrainian summer heat shimmering over the trampled wheat fields. It is an atmosphere you can taste, a foul cocktail of acrid black powder smoke, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the stench of sweat-soaked wool uniforms, and the sweet, sickly odor of torn flesh beginning to spoil under the relentless sun. The sound is an inhuman symphony from hell, not the clean clash of steel, but a deafening, continuous roar of cannon, the rolling thunder of musket volleys, and underneath it all, a horrifying human hum composed of thousands of screams, prayers, and death rattles. Through this inferno, a litter is being carried, jostled by desperate men. On it lies a king, his face pale and contorted, not just from the agony of a festering bullet wound in his foot, but from the spiritual torment of a man watching his life's work, his nation's destiny, and his own legend turn to ash before his very eyes. This is Charles XIV, the Lion of the North, the undefeated Alexander of his age. He is 37 years old, and he is witnessing the live-fire birth of the Russian Empire, an empire being forged at this very moment in the furnace of his own annihilated army. For the first time, his legendary blue-uniformed Caroliners are not advancing in their terrifying silent charge. They are broken, fleeing, dissolving into a panicked mob under a relentless iron hailstorm. To understand how this man, this demigod of war who had held Europe in his thrall for a decade, ended up here, broken and helpless in the vast, indifferent expanse of the East, is to understand the terrible, seductive power of glory. This is the narrative of him, Charles XIV of Sweden, the last of the Viking kings to shake the world. This was the saga of how a boy genius, a soldier of such terrifying proficiency that he was compared to Alexander the Great, took the mighty Swedish Empire, the Stormaktstiden, the age of greatness, and burned it as a sacrificial offering on the altar of his own unbending will. The central, dramatic paradox of his life is the story of a man whose greatest strengths were the very tools of his kingdom's destruction. His iron courage became reckless obstinacy. His profound sense of honor became a suicidal inability to compromise. His tactical brilliance blinded him to strategic catastrophe. The core question, therefore, is not merely what defeated Charles XIV, but how. How did this soldier on the throne, who for 9 years knew nothing but victory, systematically dismantle one of Europe's great powers? Was he a tragic hero broken by fate, a stubborn fool who misread the changing world, or a man possessed by an inner demon, a hunger for a pure, absolute glory that could never be attained in the messy, imperfect world of men? To find the answer, we must journey back to the world that forged him, a world trembling on the cusp of a new century, where the old gods of war were about to be challenged by new, more brutal deities of statecraft, logistics, and artillery. The story of Charles is the story of a man who faced a storm and, instead of seeking shelter, tried to command the wind and the rain, believing even the heavens would bend to his will. To understand this man, we must first return to the world of the late 17th century, a grand and brutal geopolitical chessboard poised for a violent realignment. In the West, the glorious son of Louis XIV's France, the Sun King, was beginning its long, slow descent, exhausted by decades of continental warfare. The vast and fragmented Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of hundreds of principalities, was a slumbering giant, powerful but disunited. To the southeast, the Ottoman Empire, the terror of Christendom for centuries, had been checked at the gates of Vienna, and was entering a period of stagnation, the so-called tulip period, more concerned with internal affairs than European conquest. Into this power vacuum of the north had stepped the kingdom of Sweden. For a century, through the genius of rulers like Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden had transformed itself from a sparse, peripheral nation into a Protestant superpower, the master of the Baltic. Its empire, the Dominium Maris Baltaci, was a necklace of territories strung around this vital northern sea. Finland, Karelia, Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and valuable German possessions like Pomerania and Bremen-Verden. Sweden's army was not the largest in Europe, but it was universally acknowledged as the best, a professional, disciplined, and technologically advanced force, with a fearsome doctrine of shock and awe. Yet this Swedish dominance was a source of profound resentment for its neighbors. Denmark, its old rival, chafed at the loss of its southern provinces. The ambitious Elector of Saxony, Augustus the Strong, who had recently been elected king of the vast and chaotic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, dreamed of seizing Livonia. But the most significant, though widely underestimated player on this board, was to the east. Here lay the immense semi-Asiatic Tsardom of Muscovy, a realm of vast distances, crushing autocracy and deep military backwardness. It was a sleeping bear, a nation that had yet to truly enter the European stage. But its new Tsar, a young man of titanic energy and ambition named Peter, was determined to drag his nation, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. And he knew that the key to this future was a port on the Baltic, a window to Europe, which meant a direct confrontation with the Swedish lion that guarded its shores. This was the world Charles XII was about to inherit, a powerful but overstretched empire surrounded by hungry wolves. At the very moment a new, far more dangerous predator was awakening in the eastern forests. The character of this boy king, this instrument of fate, was not forged in a vacuum. It was smelted in the cold, austere, and deeply militaristic crucible of his father's court. His father, Charles XII, was a formidable figure in his own right, an absolute monarch who had spent his reign crushing the power of the high nobility and reorganizing the state for maximum military efficiency. He had created the allotment system, Indelningsverket, a unique method of military organization that provided Sweden with a permanent, well-trained standing army without the immense cost of mercenaries that burdened other European powers. The young Charles was his father's project. His education was a relentless preparation for kingship, as his father understood it, a sacred duty of command. He was drilled in military tactics, mathematics, and fortification from an age when other princes were learning to dance. His tutors were instructed to instill in him an unshakable Lutheran piety, a belief that he was God's chosen instrument on earth, and a stoic indifference to pain and luxury. Legends from his youth abound. He was a fearless horseman, a relentless hunter of bears and wolves, and a young man who seemed to feel neither cold nor fear. He learned to sleep on the floor with a cloak for a blanket, to eat the simple, coarse food of a soldier, and to speak little, preferring action to words. This upbringing created a personality of immense strengths and terrifying weaknesses. It gave him an iron will, unparalleled physical courage, and a deep personal connection to the soldiers he would one day lead. But it denied him any training in the arts of diplomacy, compromise, or persuasion. He was taught that the will of the king was absolute, and that any problem could be solved through direct, forceful application of power. This was not the education of a statesman who must balance competing interests and navigate the murky waters of international relations. It was the forging of a weapon, a perfect gleaming sword, designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to cut through any obstacle in its path. When he ascended the throne, he was less a king than the living embodiment of the Swedish military machine itself. The moment this newly forged weapon was unleashed upon the world came with breathtaking speed. In the year 1700, the coalition of Sweden's rivals decided the time was ripe to strike. They saw a 15-year-old boy on the throne, a nation supposedly weakened by a recent famine, and an opportunity too good to pass up. Augustus the Strong of Poland-Saxony moved his troops to besiege the strategic city of Riga in Swedish Livonia. Frederick IV of Denmark prepared to invade Sweden's southern ally, Holstein-Gottorp, and the great eastern bear, Peter's Russia, began its slow, ponderous march towards the Swedish fortress of Narva. This was meant to be a quick, surgical dismemberment of an overextended empire led by a child. It was their first and most catastrophic misreading of the man they faced. Charles's response was not the panicked diplomacy of a boy ruler, but the coiled fury of a predator. His focus was absolute. He declared, "I have resolved never to start an unjust war, but also never to end a just one without defeating my enemy." He ignored Augustus and Peter for the moment, and decided to eliminate the most immediate threat first, with a plan of stunning audacity. Instead of fighting the Danes in Germany, he would strike at the heart of Denmark itself. Gathering his army and navy, he executed a daring amphibious landing at Humlebæk on the island of Zealand, just a few miles from the Danish capital of Copenhagen. It was a textbook operation, with the young king personally wading ashore through the waves, the first to set foot on enemy soil. The Danish defenses, caught completely by surprise, crumbled. Faced with the prospect of a full-scale siege of his capital, Frederick IV capitulated. Within a few short weeks, by August of 1700, the Treaty of Travendal was signed, and Denmark was forced out of the war. Europe was in shock. The boy king had not just defended his realm, he had attacked, and in a single brilliant stroke, had knocked out one of the 3 heads of the Hydra that had come to devour him. It was a first taste of the lightning warfare that would become his trademark, but it also sent a dangerous message to the young king himself, that audacity always pays, and that the sword is the only argument an enemy truly understands. To comprehend the 2 decades of relentless warfare that followed, one must understand the central, almost spiritual motivation that drove this king. Charles XII was not a monarch in the mold of a Louis XIV, driven by a desire for territorial aggrandizement and dynastic power. Nor was he like his great rival Peter, driven by a pragmatic need to modernize his state and secure its economic future. Charles was animated by something more archaic, more absolute: the concept of era. This Swedish word, inadequately translated as honor or glory, was for him a sacred, all-encompassing principle. It was the reputation of his kingdom, the sanctity of its treaties, and the inviolability of his royal person, all fused into one. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of a religious zealot, that he had been placed on the throne by God to defend this era against a world of treacherous and dishonorable foes. In his worldview, the attacks by Denmark, Saxony, and Russia were not just geopolitical maneuvers. They were profound moral transgressions, acts of perjury against signed treaties that had to be punished with righteous fury. This is why he could never accept a negotiated peace that did not involve the complete and utter humiliation of his enemies. To do so would be to admit that their transgressions had some legitimacy, to stain his own era. This mindset explains his seemingly irrational decisions, such as spending 6 years obsessively pursuing Augustus the Strong through Poland long after he ceased to be a major threat. For Charles, Augustus was an oath-breaker who had to be deposed and replaced, not for any strategic gain, but as a matter of cosmic justice. This inner demon, this inflexible code of honor, made him a terrifying opponent in the short term, as it gave him a singular focus and a willingness to take risks that other monarchs would deem insane. But it was also his fatal flaw. He was playing a game of medieval chivalry on a chessboard where the rules were rapidly changing, where pragmatic self-interest, not divine right, was becoming the guiding principle of nations. His quest for glory was absolute, and it demanded a price that his kingdom, in the long run, could not possibly afford to pay. The path of this soldier king was not defined by a trusted mentor or a fateful alliance, but by the formidable triumvirate of adversaries who inadvertently summoned his martial genius into being. His entire reign, from its explosive beginning to its tragic end, was a duel, a long and bloody conversation with these three men. The first, Frederick IV of Denmark, was a conventional and cautious ruler, quickly overawed and knocked out of the war, serving primarily as the initial catalyst for Charles's explosion onto the European scene. The second, and the object of Charles's long-running obsession, was Augustus II the Strong, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Augustus was in many ways Charles's polar opposite, a man of immense physical strength, but weak moral character, a bon vivant who reveled in courtly decadence, a politician who navigated the treacherous currents of Polish noble politics with cynical pragmatism. Charles despised him with a cold fury, viewing him not as a legitimate enemy monarch, but as a perfidious rogue who had unworthily acquired a crown. The king's multi-year campaign to hunt him down and depose him would drain precious resources and, more importantly, precious time. But the third and ultimate antagonist, the one who would become the co-author of his fate, was Peter the Marne of Russia. If Augustus was Charles's opposite, Peter was his dark mirror. Both were absolute monarchs. Both were men of immense energy and iron will, and both were determined to forge their nations into great powers. But their methods and personalities could not have been more different. Charles was a conservative, a puritanical warrior defending a pre-existing order, a man who perfected the tools of war he had inherited. Peter was a revolutionary, a brutal protean force of nature, a man who would destroy the old Muscovy to build his new Russia, a pragmatist who learned from his mistakes and was willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of his own subjects to achieve his goals. The Great Northern War, therefore, was more than a conflict over territory. It was a titanic, 20-year struggle between these two men, a clash of opposing philosophies of rule, of war, and of destiny. It was in the crucible of this rivalry that both the Russian Empire would be born and the Swedish Empire would be immolated. The first act of this grand drama, the swift and brutal dispatching of Denmark, had served as the overture. The second act began immediately, as Charles turned his attention east, where the lumbering Russian army was laying siege to the Swedish fortress of Narva on the Estonian coast. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a set-piece battle that would define Charles's reputation for the next decade. In the summer of 1700, he transported his small army of around 10,000 men across the Baltic. The situation looked grim. The fortress was besieged by a Russian force that outnumbered the Swedes by at least 4-1, entrenched and protected by formidable siege lines. A direct assault seemed suicidal. Any other commander might have sought a more cautious approach, but Charles saw only the opportunity for a decisive, glorious blow. He marched his army through the bitter cold of the advancing winter, driving them relentlessly towards the enemy. On November 30th, 1700, as a furious blizzard descended upon the battlefield, blotting out the sky and reducing visibility to a few feet, Charles gave the order to attack. The Swedish army, with the wind and snow at their backs, advanced like ghosts out of the storm. The Russian troops, blinded by the snow and caught completely by surprise, panicked. Their commanders, mostly foreign mercenaries with little loyalty to their men, were among the first to surrender. The massive Russian army dissolved into a terrified mob, which broke and fled, trampling their own comrades in a desperate attempt to escape across a single collapsing bridge over the Narva River. The victory was total, almost unbelievable. With a force of around 8,000 men who actually took part in the assault, Charles had routed an army of 40,000, capturing their entire artillery park and officer corps. Europe was dumbfounded. The boy king was hailed as a new Gustavus Adolphus, a Protestant hero sent by God. But this stunning triumph, this baptism of fire and ice, was also the price of his future power, for it planted a seed of contempt in his heart that would one day grow into a poisonous tree. The true antagonist in this epic struggle was not the foppish Augustus or the quickly dispatched Frederick, but a far more profound and implacable foe. The vast, unforgiving geography and immense human reservoir of Russia. This was an enemy of a different nature from those encountered in the cabinet wars of Western Europe. Charles's Swedish army was a masterpiece of the military art, a finely honed rapier, professional, disciplined, and deadly in a stand-up fight. But Russia was a vast, amorphous entity, a featherbed that could absorb the deepest thrust of that rapier and swallow it whole. Its power did not lie in the quality of its individual soldiers, who were at the start of the war poorly trained and miserably led, but in its sheer scale. Peter could lose an entire army, as he did at Narva, and simply raise another from the seemingly endless ocean of his peasantry. He could afford to trade space for time, luring an invading army ever deeper into his territory, stretching its supply lines to the breaking point, and letting the legendary General Winter and General Mud do their grim work. This was a form of warfare for which the Swedish doctrine, predicated on winning a single decisive battle, was ill-suited. Charles, a man who thought in terms of battlefields and campaigns, was facing an opponent who was beginning to think in terms of industrial production, logistics, and demographic attrition. Peter understood, in a way Charles never would, that the new wars of the 18th century would be won not just by brilliant generals, but by powerful states capable of mobilizing their entire population and economy for the war effort. The clash between Sweden and Russia was therefore not merely a clash of two armies, but a clash of two systems. The small, highly efficient, but brittle Swedish war machine against the vast, inefficient, but incredibly resilient Russian state. In the end, the rapier would break against the anvil. If the victory at Narva was the moment Charles became a legend, it was also the scene of his first and most profound, fatal mistake. This miscalculation was not tactical, but psychological, a catastrophic breaking point in his perception of reality. Standing amidst the captured Russian standards and the thousands of surrendered soldiers, the young king did not see a victory won by audacity and aided by the freak chance of a blizzard. He saw, with the clarifying simplicity of a zealot, divine proof of a fundamental truth, that his Swedes were a race of natural warriors, and that the Russians were a subhuman rabble, a cowardly and incompetent herd that could be scattered by a single, determined charge. This conviction, born in the snows of Narva, became a fixed and unshakable dogma in his mind. He utterly dismissed Peter and his army as a serious long-term threat. He wrote them off. This single, arrogant assumption would dictate his entire strategy for the next 9 years. He believed he could deal with the Russian problem at his leisure whenever he chose. The more pressing task, in his honor-bound view, was to punish the faithless oath-breaker, Augustus the Strong. And so, instead of marching east to consolidate his victory and perhaps force a final, decisive peace on a terrified Peter, he turned his magnificent army south into the political and military labyrinth of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He would spend 6 crucial years, from 1701 to 1706, mired in a grueling war of sieges, pursuits, and political maneuvering, chasing Augustus across the plains of Poland. These were years of constant Swedish victories, but they were strategically barren. And while Charles was busy playing kingmaker in Poland, he was giving his greatest enemy the one gift he could not afford: time. Time for Peter to digest the humiliating lesson of Narva, to rebuild his army along modern European lines, to purge his incompetent officers, and to begin methodically chipping away at Sweden's Baltic provinces. The decision to turn south after Narva was the hinge on which the fate of his empire would turn, a mistake born not of incompetence, but of a blinding, victorious hubris. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at the turn of the 18th century, was a vortex of chaos, a sprawling, multi-ethnic state that was less a kingdom than a nobleman's republic with an elected king. It was a political quagmire, a land of powerful, feuding magnate families who jealously guarded their golden liberty and were notorious for switching allegiances for personal gain. It was into this chaos that Charles XIII plunged his army, seeking to use the internal divisions of the Commonwealth to his advantage. His objective was not merely to defeat Augustus the Strong's Saxon army, but to have him legally deposed by the Polish Diet, Sejm, and replaced with a king of his own choosing. This was an opportunity born from the very weakness of his enemy's position. Charles skillfully played the role of the liberator, claiming he had come to free the Poles from their unwanted and duplicitous Saxon king. He found allies among the powerful families who opposed Augustus, such as the Sapiehas. For years, the war became a strange hybrid of conventional battles and political theater. Charles would win a spectacular victory against Saxon and Polish forces, as he did at the Battle of Klisów in 1702, and then spend months trying to cajole and intimidate the Polish nobles into following his will. He marched his army back and forth across the vast territory, from Warsaw to Krakow, from Thorn to Lwów, effectively occupying the country. Eventually, through sheer military dominance and relentless pressure, he succeeded. In 1704, a confederation of nobles in Warsaw declared Augustus deposed and, under Charles's watchful eye, elected the young and pliable Stanisław Leszczyński as the new king. Charles had achieved his political objective. He had used the internal chaos of Poland to unseat his rival. But the cost was enormous. He had been drawn deep into a conflict that had no clear end, bleeding men and resources. All while the Russian bear he had wounded at Narva was healing, growing stronger, and beginning to stir once more on the northern horizon. The absolute climax of Act II of this epic saga, the very peak of Charles XIV's power and glory, was not a battle, but a treaty signed in silence. By 1706, Charles had chased Augustus the Strong out of Poland and pursued him back into his hereditary lands of Saxony. In a daring move, he invaded Saxony itself, deep within the territory of the Holy Roman Empire, a move that sent shockwaves across Europe. With the Swedish army camped just outside Leipzig, living off the rich Saxon land, a terrified Augustus had no choice but to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Altanstedt, signed in September 1706, represented the zenith of Swedish power. The terms were a complete and total humiliation for Augustus. He was forced to renounce all claims to the Polish throne, to officially recognize Charles's puppet, Stanisław Leszczyński, and to break his alliance with Russia. He even had to surrender Russian officials who had sought refuge in his court. Charles, at the age of just 24, had become the undisputed arbiter of Central and Eastern Europe. His military camp in Saxony became the temporary capital of the North. Ambassadors from every major European power, from France to England to the Holy Roman Empire, flocked to his Spartan headquarters, eager to curry favor with this terrifyingly successful young conqueror. The Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I was forced to return confiscated churches to his Protestant subjects in Silesia simply because Charles demanded it. For a brief, shining moment, the King of Sweden held the balance of power in Europe in his hands. He had defeated and humiliated two of his three enemies. His army, seasoned by 6 years of continuous warfare, was considered invincible. The path was now clear for the final act, the reckoning with his last and greatest foe, Tsar Peter of Russia. At this moment of supreme triumph, camped in the heart of Germany with Europe at his feet, we must pause and attempt to enter the mind of the king. What was the psychology of this triumph? It was a moment of profound, almost religious vindication. Charles did not see his success as the result of good strategy or the discipline of his troops alone. He saw it as the clear and unambiguous judgment of God. He was his nation's hero, the Alexander of the North, the instrument of divine will sent to punish the wicked and restore a just order. This belief in his own destiny, always strong, now hardened into an unshakable and dangerous certainty. He was no longer just a king, he was a cause. This period of hubris was marked by his famous, almost contemptuous, dismissal of diplomacy. When the great powers, embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession, sent their finest diplomats, including the legendary Duke of Marlborough, to his camp, hoping to entice him to join their cause, he showed almost no interest. He had his own war to finish, his own justice to dispense. He rejected all overtures from Peter for a peace settlement, which at this point would have been wildly favorable to Sweden. Why his thinking went, should he negotiate with a perfidious enemy whom he was about to crush? He believed the coming invasion of Russia would be little more than a police action, a final, swift campaign to topple the upstart Tsar and dismantle his work. This psychology of triumph, this absolute belief in his own invincibility and righteousness, was the very thing that made the subsequent catastrophe not only possible, but inevitable. He had climbed so high that he could no longer see the ground, and he was about to step off the edge of the world, convinced he could fly. While Charles was basking in the Saxon sun, dictating terms and seeing himself as the master of Europe, his sworn enemy was engaged in a very different project. To understand the coming cataclysm, one must understand the man who was preparing it. Peter the Great was a force of nature, a figure who seemed to defy all the conventions of monarchy. Nearly 7 feet tall, with a restless, almost manic energy, he was a whirlwind of contradictions. He was a brutal, cruel autocrat who would personally participate in the torture of his political enemies. Yet he was also possessed of an insatiable, childlike curiosity about the workings of the world. He was the Tsar of all the Russias, yet he was happiest in a shipyard, dressed in simple workman's clothes, learning the arts of shipbuilding and dentistry. While Charles was a product of a rigid, traditional military education, Peter was a radical pragmatist, obsessed with the technology and methods of the West. During his grand embassy to Europe, he had studied everything from naval architecture in Holland to artillery in Prussia. The humiliating defeat at Narva had been his harshest but most valuable lesson. It had burned away his illusions about the old Muscovite army. In the years of Charles's Polish distraction, Peter had undertaken a revolution. He had rebuilt his army from the ground up, using European officers, modern flintlock muskets, and a new emphasis on discipline and artillery. He had created a Russian navy from nothing. And most symbolically, in 1703, on marshy ground captured from Sweden at the mouth of the Neva River, he founded a new city, St. Petersburg. This was not just a new capital. It was a geopolitical statement, a window to Europe built defiantly on enemy land. Peter was everything Charles was not: adaptable, patient, pragmatic, and willing to learn from his own failures. He was forging a new Russia, a modern, militarized empire, and he was tempering it in the fires of the long war, waiting for the moment when his creation would be ready to face its ultimate test against the master. In stark contrast to Peter's frantic project of state-building, Charles XIV's reign saw no such domestic construction. The Swedish state, already a highly efficient absolutist monarchy thanks to his father, was not reformed or developed. It was simply optimized for a single purpose: to serve as the logistical engine for the king's ceaseless war. Sweden itself became a vast barracks and supply depot. While the king campaigned abroad for 18 years, the administration in Stockholm, led by the capable council of the realm, was tasked with the grim and relentless work of finding more men, more money, and more resources to feed the hungry war machine. The allotment system provided a steady stream of disciplined soldiers. But as the war dragged on, the pool of available men began to shrink. The nation's immense mineral wealth, particularly its copper and iron, was poured into the production of cannons, muskets, and swords. Taxes were raised to punishing levels, and the crown resorted to devaluing its currency to meet its obligations. There were no grand architectural projects, no flourishing of the arts at court, no reforms of commerce or agriculture. All the energies of the state, all the talent of its people, were directed outwards, towards the campaigns in Poland, Saxony, and ultimately, Russia. Charles ruled his distant empire by courier, sending dispatches from his campaign tents with instructions for the government back home. His construction, therefore, was the constant sharpening of his military instrument. The Swedish army became his sole, all-consuming project, and the Kingdom of Sweden was the raw material from which it was forged. It was a model of terrifying efficiency, but it was also utterly unsustainable. The state was being bled white, its future mortgaged for the sake of the king's honor and the pursuit of a victory that remained stubbornly out of reach. The context of this king's life, the onions and vegetables that give the meat its flavor, is notable for its almost complete absence of a personal dimension. Charles's life was a public spectacle of war, entirely devoid of the private dramas that consumed other monarchs. He never married and was rumored to be completely celibate, showing no interest in the dynastic marriages that formed the bedrock of European diplomacy. He fathered no children, leaving the succession of his ancient dynasty to his sisters, a matter of apparent indifference to him. His court was not a palace but a military camp. His companions were not courtiers and artists, but his grizzled generals, men like Carl Gustav Renskiold and Adam Ludwig Löwenhaupt, and the common soldiers with whom he shared the hardships of the campaign. He dressed in a simple blue uniform, indistinguishable from that of a common officer, and his diet was famously frugal. This asceticism was a powerful tool of leadership. His soldiers adored him, seeing him not as a distant sovereign, but as a true soldier king who bore the same risks and suffered the same privations they did. This created the legendary discipline and morale of the Caroliner army, men who would follow him literally to the ends of the earth. But this utter sublimation of the personal into the political and military had a profound and damaging consequence. It cut him off from the human reality of his kingdom. He received reports of plague, famine, and economic collapse from Stockholm, not as the tragedies of his people, but as logistical problems that might impede his next campaign. His single-minded focus on the war made him a brilliant general, but a deeply flawed king. A man who had become so detached from the wellspring of his own power that he was willing to drain it completely dry in his pursuit of victory. By 1707, as Charles prepared to launch his long-awaited invasion of Russia, the first ominous cracks had begun to appear in the edifice of the Swedish Empire. These were the harbingers of the coming storm, largely ignored by the supremely confident king, but deeply troubling to his advisors back in Stockholm. The most glaring sign was the situation in the Baltic provinces. While Charles had been chasing Augustus through Poland, Peter had been systematically conquering Sweden's eastern territories. The key fortresses of Göteborg and Nyenskans had fallen, giving Russia its foothold on the Neva. Dorpat, and most critically, Narva itself, had been retaken by the Russians in 1704. The entire province of Ingria was now in Russian hands, and Peter's new city, St. Petersburg, was rising on what was, by treaty, Swedish soil. This was not just a territorial loss. It was a strategic dagger aimed at the heart of Sweden's Baltic dominance. Furthermore, the war was proving to be a catastrophic drain on Sweden's finite resources. The kingdom's population was less than 2 million people, and it had been providing soldiers for a major war for 7 straight years. Manpower was running low. At home, the economy was faltering, trade was disrupted by Danish and Russian privateers, and a deadly plague was beginning to sweep through the land, further devastating the population. Letters from the Royal Council in Stockholm to the king's camp were becoming increasingly desperate in tone, speaking of an exhausted and impoverished nation. But Charles, insulated from this reality in his victorious military bubble, dismissed these concerns. He believed that one final decisive campaign against Russia would solve everything. He would crush Peter, march on Moscow, and dictate a peace that would restore all the lost territories and secure Sweden's glory for a generation. He heard the approaching thunder, but he mistook it for the applause of destiny. The fateful act, the single decision that transformed a difficult campaign into an irreversible catastrophe, came in the autumn of 1708. Charles had finally launched his grand invasion of Russia at the head of a magnificent army of nearly 40,000 men, one of the largest and best-equipped forces he had ever commanded. His initial plan was a direct march on Moscow, but Peter, having learned the lesson of Narva, refused to offer a decisive battle. Instead, the Russian army adopted a ruthless, scorched earth policy, retreating before the Swedes and destroying everything in their path: food, fodder, and shelter. The Swedish advance slowed to a crawl. They won a costly victory at the Battle of Holuchin, but it was not the decisive blow Charles sought. As the unusually cold autumn set in, the Swedish army found itself in a barren, hostile land, with its supply lines stretched to the breaking point and a crucial supply column under General Löwenhaupt lagging far behind. It was at this moment of crisis that Charles made his fatal choice. Instead of retreating to a secure winter base or pressing on towards Moscow despite the risks, he listened to a tempting offer from Ivan Mazepa, the aging hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks, who promised to switch his allegiance to Sweden and provide his army with ample supplies and 50,000 Cossack warriors if Charles would march south into the Ukraine. The psychology of this era was a complex mix of arrogance and necessity. Charles, who had never known a major setback, could not countenance a retreat. He still believed in his star, his good fortune that had never failed him. Mazepa's offer seemed like a godsend, a way to outflank the Russians and replenish his exhausted army. So he turned his army south, away from Moscow and towards the rich plains of Ukraine. It was a monumental gamble. He was marching deeper into enemy territory, further from his own bases, banking everything on the promises of a new, unproven ally. The turn south was a step into the unknown, a march towards a destiny that would be decided not by a single battle, but by hunger, frost, and the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Russian plain. The greatest catastrophe, the moment the Swedish Empire broke its back, was not a single day, but a long, agonizing season of despair culminating in a few hours of hell. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the most brutal in recorded history, the so-called Great Frost. For the Swedish army, stranded in the Ukraine, it was an apocalypse. They were unprepared for the ferocity of the cold, which plunged to temperatures so low that birds froze in mid-flight. Thousands of soldiers, weakened by malnutrition, succumbed to frostbite, starvation, and disease. Mazepa's promised aid proved to be a mirage. The Russians, forewarned of his betrayal, had sacked his capital and destroyed his supplies, and only a few thousand Cossacks joined the Swedish king. By the spring of 1709, when the ragged, depleted Swedish army, now numbering barely 20,000 effective soldiers, limped towards the small fortress of Poltava, it was a shadow of its former self. It was here that Peter chose to make his stand, with a fresh, well-supplied, and vastly superior Russian army of over 40,000 men, protected by formidable redoubts and a massive advantage in artillery. The battle itself, on June 28th, was a foregone conclusion. The sensory assault was one of total, overwhelming firepower. The Swedish infantry, advancing with their customary valor, were simply blasted apart by a storm of Russian cannon and musket fire before they could even reach the main lines. Their legendary go-po shock tactic, so effective against panicked troops at Narva, shattered against the disciplined fire of Peter's new army. Compounding the disaster, Charles himself could not lead. A few days earlier, he had been struck in the foot by a stray bullet while reconnoitering, and he had to be carried on a litter, unable to exert personal command at the crucial moment. The result was chaos, a piecemeal attack that was brutally repulsed. The Swedish army did not just retreat, it disintegrated. The field of Poltava became the graveyard of Sweden's age of greatness. The immediate aftermath of Poltava was a collapse as swift and total as the victory at Narva 9 years prior. The battle itself had been a brutal defeat, but the true collapse came 3 days later at the small town of Perevolocna, on the banks of the Dnieper River. Here, the pathetic remnant of the once proud Swedish army, numbering some 15,000 demoralized and starving men, found itself trapped, with the river at its back and the pursuing Russian army closing in. Charles, feverish and barely conscious from his wound, was bundled into a small boat with Mazepa and a handful of followers and ferried across the river to begin his long flight towards the safety of the Ottoman Empire. For the army he left behind, there was no hope. General Leeuwenhaupt, now in command, was forced to sign an unconditional surrender. In a single moment, the entire field army that had been the shield and sword of the Swedish Empire for a decade simply ceased to exist. The psychological shock across Europe was immense. The myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered forever. The news of the disaster acted as a signal for Sweden's old enemies to pounce on the wounded lion. Augustus the Strong swiftly returned to Poland and reclaimed his throne. Denmark and Saxony re-entered the war. They were soon joined by Prussia and Hanover, all eager to claim a piece of the crumbling Swedish imperium. Sweden itself, now stripped of its main army, was left almost completely defenseless, its Baltic and German provinces vulnerable to invasion. Charles, meanwhile, was no longer the arbiter of Europe, but a refugee, an exile in Bender in Ottoman Moldavia, where he would spend the next 5 years as a guest of the Sultan, a king without an army, desperately trying to cajole the Turks into attacking Russia, while his own empire was being systematically torn apart. The collapse was absolute. The final scene of this royal tragedy is fittingly grim, chaotic, and suffused with a soldier's pathos. After 5 years of exile, a period of increasingly bizarre and stubborn intrigue at the Ottoman court, known as the Kalabalik at Bender, Charles finally accepted the hopelessness of his situation. He embarked on a legendary, desperate 2-week horseback ride across Europe, traveling incognito through enemy territory to finally return to Swedish Pomerania in November of 1714. He arrived not as a conquering hero, but as the ghost of a king returning to a realm on the verge of total collapse. His German possessions were lost, Finland was under Russian occupation, and his enemies were preparing to invade Sweden itself. Yet the king's iron will was not broken. He managed to rally his exhausted, bled-white nation for one last, defiant struggle. He raised new armies from a people who had already given everything, implementing harsh taxes and turning the entire country into a fortress. His final gamble was an invasion of Norway, then ruled by Denmark, in an attempt to break the enemy coalition and force a more favorable peace. It was during the siege of the Norwegian fortress of Fredrikstad on the night of November 30th, 1718, the anniversary of his great victory at Narva, that the hero's finale arrived. While inspecting the forward siege trenches, a common practice for this hands-on commander, he was struck in the head by a single projectile and killed instantly. The circumstances have been debated for centuries. Was it an enemy shot from the fortress, or was he assassinated by his own war-weary nobles? The truth is almost secondary to the brutal irony of the scene. The Lion of the North, the man who had commanded vast armies in epic battles, did not die in a blaze of glory at the head of a cavalry charge. He died in the cold mud of a trench, in a secondary theater of a war he had already lost. A lonely soldier's death that brought the curtain down on his turbulent life and the empire he had led to ruin. The legacy of Charles XIV is a maelstrom of conflicting interpretations, a historical ghost who haunts the national consciousness of multiple nations. In Sweden, he is a figure of profound and painful ambiguity. For generations of nationalists and romantics, he was Hjälten, the hero, the embodiment of Swedish valor and sacrifice, a tragic warrior king who fought against impossible odds. His soldiers, the Caroliners, became symbols of loyalty and endurance. Yet, for many modern Swedish historians and the public, he is the man who inherited a great power and, through his stubbornness and obsession, systematically destroyed it, leading the country into a century of poverty and political decline. He is both the symbol of Sweden's greatest glory and the architect of its definitive fall. In Russia, his legacy is far simpler and more straightforward. He is the arrogant, foolish invader, the perfect foil for the heroic narrative of Peter the Great. The Battle of Poltava is not just a military victory, it is a foundational event in Russian history. The moment Russia announced its arrival as a major European power by defeating the most feared army of the age. Charles is a necessary villain in the story of Russia's birth as an empire. For military historians, the conflict of interpretation continues. Was he a tactical genius of the highest order, a master of maneuver and the decisive blow? Unquestionably. But was he a strategic simpleton, a man who repeatedly won battles while losing the war, unable to grasp the larger political and economic realities of the conflict? The evidence for this is equally compelling. He remains a paradox, a brilliant soldier and a catastrophic statesman, a king revered for his courage and condemned for his folly. We return, finally, to the core question. How did this boy king burn his kingdom to ash for the sake of glory? The solution to this paradox lies in the profound, tragic realization that Charles XIII was a man whose personality was fundamentally incompatible with the demands of early modern kingship. The soldier had completely consumed the king. His greatest virtues on the battlefield were precisely the qualities that proved to be catastrophic vices in the realm of statecraft. His unbending will, which allowed him to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat at Narva, became the blind obstinacy that prevented him from making a pragmatic peace after his victories in Poland and Saxony. His profound sense of personal and national honor, the era that drove him to punish oath-breakers, became a monomaniacal obsession that led him into the Polish quagmire and the Ukrainian wasteland, squandering years and resources that his kingdom could not spare. His military genius, his belief in the single, decisive battle, made him incapable of understanding the new kind of war Peter was waging, a war of attrition, logistics, and scorched earth. He was a master of the sprint, trapped in a marathon he could not comprehend. He was, in essence, a man fighting the last war, a perfect medieval warrior king who found himself in the dawning age of the cabinet wars, where the interests of the state were beginning to supersede the honor of the sovereign. He did not burn his empire out of malice or incompetence, but out of an excess of his own defining virtue, an absolute, unwavering, and ultimately self-destructive commitment to his own code. The storm that defeated him was not merely the Russian winter or Peter's cannons. It was the storm of a changing world, one that had no place for a king who believed that will alone could conquer reality. The ultimate philosophical conclusion to be drawn from the saga of Charles XIII is a timeless and sobering verdict on the nature of power and personality. His life serves as a terrifying case study in how the character flaws of a single individual, when magnified by the lens of absolute monarchy, can steer a powerful nation towards utter ruin. Charles was not a tyrant in the conventional sense. He was not cruel to his own people for personal gain, nor did he indulge in decadent luxury. He was, in his own mind, the first and most devoted servant of the Swedish state. Yet, his very devotion, filtered through his rigid, militaristic, and honor-bound worldview, became the poison that killed it. The story is a profound lesson on the danger of mistaking a part for the whole, of believing that military prowess is synonymous with national strength, or that a king's personal honor is the same as his country's strategic interest. It is the tragedy of the specialist. Charles was a peerless specialist in the art of war, but a king must be a generalist, a balancer of competing needs, military, economic, diplomatic, and social. Because he could not, or would not, play this balancing role, he allowed his war machine to devour the very nation it was meant to protect. His story is a monument to the idea that no amount of personal courage or tactical brilliance can compensate for a fundamental lack of strategic vision and political wisdom. He stands in history as the last Viking, a magnificent and awe-inspiring anachronism, a warrior king whose medieval virtues were no match for the cold, calculating pragmatism of the emerging modern world. The final frame, the image that encapsulates this entire epic of fire and ice, is not the grand panorama of Poltava or the glittering diplomatic assembly at Altenstedt. It is a small, quiet, and intensely lonely scene. A muddy trench, dug into the frozen Norwegian earth on a black, wind-swept night. A single figure, silhouetted against the faint glow of the enemy fortress, peering over the parapet. This is the king. Not in shining armor, not on a charging war horse, but alone in the dark, performing the humble duty of a common officer. There is the flat, wet crack of a single gunshot, and the figure slumps, disappearing from view. The silence that rushes in to fill the void is not just the absence of a single man's life, but the silence of an empire's ambition expiring. The great storm of the North, the hurricane of war that he had unleashed and ridden for 18 years, had finally passed, leaving behind a broken kingdom and a profound, exhausted quiet. The cold Scandinavian wind blows over the fortress of Fredrikstad, carrying with it the whispers of what was and what might have been, the last, fading echo of the lion's roar and the definitive end of Sweden's age of greatness.